So Evie Knight is the author of the Bram Stoker Award-winning debut novel, The Fourth Whore. She released her sophomore novel, Children of Demeter, as well as a novella, Pardum, in 2021. Evie lives in one of America's most haunted cities, Savannah, Georgia. She is a huge fan of the Savannah Bananas and the beauty of Bonaventure Cemetery. When not out and about searching for the ghosts of the past, Evie can be found at her home with her husband, Matt, her beloved Chinese crested Gozer Augustus, and their three naughty Sphinx cats. I am going to hop off.
Okay, fabulous. Hi, everyone. So in preparing for this lecture, I made a PowerPoint. So I'm going to share that screen with you all very soon. And I think when I share the screen, I might not be able to see if you have questions or anything. So what I'll try to do maybe is periodically check on that. I'm still learning all this techie stuff, so stay with me. But I'm so excited to talk about villains today because I love writing villains. Villains is one of my favorite things. So I wore my little villain hat today too, because it's so fun. And I hope it doesn't seem overwhelming, because writing villains is probably, I think, the funnest part to being a writer. And I'm going to try to make it all genre. Okay, so I'm trying really hard not to do horror, which is what I write. So I really tried to focus on across the board villains. So here we go. I'm going to try to share the screen, and then let's see, hold, and then we'll do this, and here we go. Oh, okay. Oh, I can see chat. Awesome. And question and answer. Okay, perfect. So crafting the perfect villain in 8 easy steps. I put my email on there only because I'm not sure if you'll be able to access this after the fact. If you want this PowerPoint and you don't get it and you want it, just you can email me. I'll be happy to send it to all of you if you like. So here's just some villains off the top of my head that I put together. Here we go. Recognize any of your favorites. Hopefully at least one. All right, so let's start with just definitions. And so this is really just for semantic purposes. In this lecture, villain and antagonist typically can be used interchangeable, but just to be clear, an antagonist is a character that just opposes your protagonist or your villain, right? They're the opposite, antagonist. They can be an anti-hero. Their job in your book is to make life difficult for your protagonist. They're disagreeable. They're throwing obstacles, right? A villain is always an antagonist, right? But an antagonist doesn't have to be a villain. And so, yeah, I know it sounds like an SAT question, right? But it's not. So an example that would be Draco, right? Draco Malfoy is an antagonist. You know, he makes life difficult for Harry the whole way through, all the time. He's always there. He's like the thorn in the side, right? But he's not the big villain of the story. The big villain of the story over here is Voldemort. He is evil. Villains they destroy, they kill. And a big thing to remember is that a villain doesn't always have to be a person. It doesn't have to be a human, but it also doesn't have to be something tangible. It can be intangible, it can be hatred, right? So when you think about Romeo and Juliet, really the villain of that story was the hatred between these two families, right? So some more definitions. We mentioned anti-hero, right? So an anti-hero is actually the dark hero, a flawed hero. They are often the protagonists of the story, right? Dexter, Walter White, they're the protagonists, but they don't necessarily have the redeeming qualities of the hero. Usually they're more, I don't know, I love anti-heroes because they're much more realistic. They embody kind of what we all are, right? We all have some inner darkness. We all have some inner prejudices. We all have issues that make us not truly 100% good. I mean, I'm sure every one of us, we're all good people, but we all have sort of that darkness too inside us. And yes, even Woody, right? Woody's whole arc in the first film was how much he despised and was jealous of Buzz Lightyear. And so his whole idea in that film really was to get rid of Buzz, right? So that made him an anti-hero. They're usually part hero, but also part villain. Again, more realistic. Oftentimes, though, the difference between them and a villain is there's a line that an anti-hero will not cross. Even Dexter, right? Dexter has his code, and he's a serial killer, but he still has a code. And their arc will usually start out as more bad and then sort of grow over time and become sometimes more good or develop more redeeming qualities. And then you have, of course, your protagonist and your hero, which are really, again, these are semantics, if anything. So your protagonist is your main character. They don't always have to be good. They don't have to be the hero. And the hero is somebody that's doing extraordinarily good things, right? They're overly good. And I really liked Silence of the Lambs for this example, because you have a lot of people playing a lot of different parts. You've got Hannibal Lecter really is the protagonist. He's the protagonist of Thomas Harris's whole like trilogy of books, right? He's the one that keeps showing up. He's the one we talk about. He's the one people are going to for advice, and he's the one that's doing terrible things at the same time. So he's a protagonist, but he's not a hero. Clarice is also the protagonist, right? We're following her and we're watching her evolve as time goes on. So she is also a protagonist, but Clarice is also the hero. She's the good person. She's saving the day. And I suppose we could also lump Hannibal into the villain. Besides Buffalo Bill, Hannibal's, I mean, clearly also a villain. So I really like that book because it really blurs all the lines there. So I think it's important when we talk about villains and evil and wrongdoing, right, that we step back and think for a moment just about ourselves, the society, the culture we live in, and then also what we as writers tend to, our own prejudices, right? When we're writing, we typically focus our energy, our attention on our protagonist. We put all that energy into really building this well-rounded individual and what are we going to put them through and what's their arc and all these wonderful things. And they have this backstory, but we don't always do that with our villain. And that's unfortunate because it doesn't help your protagonist to not have a really well-rounded villain. And it doesn't always make your story believable when you don't have a well-rounded villain. But also when you're thinking about your villain and you're thinking about your evil and your wrongdoing, the question you need to start asking yourself is, what is wrong in your mind? What is right in your mind? You know, what you feel is wrong and what I feel is wrong might be two different things. And I think a great example of that right now is, at least in this country, is our political system, right? We have a lot of extreme beliefs in our political system. And we have, I have friends on both sides. And I know they're good people, but their belief systems are very different. And what one feels is evil and wrong, the other feels is not, and vice versa. So I think sometimes it's a matter of what we believe is wrong when we're crafting our villain, right? And also society, it changes, right? What was wrong and evil in the 50s might not be what's wrong and evil today. This is a thought-provoking exercise. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's to kind of elucidate my point here. If you don't know this story, Jack Ketchum wrote a fictionalized version of the true story called The Girl Next Door. There's also several movie versions of this story, and it is about a 16-year-old girl who was horribly, horribly tortured and ultimately murdered by this woman who was being paid to take care of her and board her and her sister. Her parents were traveling carnival workers. And so they boarded the sisters with this woman, and she had 6 children of her own, but just took a severe disliking to these girls. And if the money from their parents were late, she would torture them even more. And then sort of just zeroed in on the one girl, Sylvia was her name, and just horrendous torture that she put this girl through, but also managed to get her children to torture this girl as well. And then ultimately neighborhood children were coming over and torturing this girl, all under her like tutelage, right? So who was the villain? Were all of them that tortured her villains? Were the kids abuse victims? And so I think I always like this. I don't like this story, but I think it's a great way to really start questioning your own belief system and your versions of what's right and what's wrong, and who is a victim and who isn't who is a victim of abuse or emotional abuse that led them down a path, and who is truly the bad guy in a story. So if you don't know about it, maybe just look it up and give it some thought. Okay, so 8 easy steps, right? So maybe 7 easy ones and 1 really complex one, but you guys have to figure out which one that is. But step 1, conflict, right? Your hero protagonist is not the most important character in your story. Your villain is. Why? Because your villain is what causes the conflict. Your villain is what poses the obstacle in the way of your hero's growth. So if you do not have a villain, you do not have conflict, you're not going to get to a climax, your hero or your protagonist isn't going to grow. It's conflict that moves your plot. No matter what genre, you have to have conflict or you don't have a story. And that's why it's really important to have your villain and have a well-rounded villain. Your biggest source of conflict, therefore, should be your villain. Your villain should continue to make the stakes bigger and bigger and bigger. Torture your protagonist. Whatever your villain wants, your villain also should have goals and motivations, right? Those things should always target your protagonist. Your protagonist is also the main obstacle and conflict for the villain. So always turn it around and look at it both ways. You can torture your protagonist with something from your villain, right? You can use your villain to really cause a lasting scar, an emotional or physical scar of your protagonist. And then also you can add some time-related pressure that will increase the intensity of the conflict. Obviously, you don't want to use it for every little obstacle or conflict that comes up, but adding a little bit of a time pressure is a great way to add conflict with your villain. Don't rush the climax, but when you do climax hard, it ultimately has to come down to a hero villain. Even if it's 2 armies, even if you've got a fantasy story going on, right? You have these 2 big armies, these 2 big countries that are going head to head. It still really ultimately comes down to whoever is leading, right? It's the leaders of those armies that are really the hero and the villain, and those are the 2 that are coming 1-to-1. It's important to start stacking advantages in your villain's favor. Give your villain some strengths that will allow you to convince the reader that this might not turn out the way I want it to. You want them to continue reading. You want them to be like, oh my gosh, is this going to end the way I want it to? Sometimes it's important to convince your reader that the villain is right? Like if the villain has a belief system, they have something that they believe so strong that they're willing to do the things they're doing. Can you convince your reader that that might be right too? Have your reader start questioning, whoa, wait a minute, they have a point. And so I'm just using the matrix there because, there's a good point for maybe we do want to live on this side of the matrix, right? Because the reality is pretty bad. So is it so bad to keep us in this matrix, right? So those are those thought-provoking things that you want your reader to be like, wait a minute, that villain has a point. Okay. Step 2, we have to have traits, right? Our villain has to have traits. So we have to create our villain. Here's a recipe. We have to bake our villain. So character traits, your villain needs them just as much as your protagonist does. You really have to structure and create your villain. We as humans, we have traits. Those traits create habits. We're creatures of habits until we aren't. And that's when we act out of character. So when we create a character in the first half of our story, our villain and our protagonist, when we have the event that forces them to act outside of their character. And that's what keeps your readers reading, but that also is what creates your villain, right? Those reactions, one is going to be one and the other one's going to go the other way. Those reactions also are what creates a good villain, because they need personality too. These books, these 2 authors have a whole line of books for writers with just lists. Right, there's also an emotions thesaurus. There's they have a bunch of different settings, like an urban setting, a rural setting thesaurus. It just gives you tons of great words, adjectives, things like that. So these are great books to own and to have, and to look into using if you're just trying to like, I'm trying to create a character. What kind of negative things could I give them, or positive, right? So I just pulled some out just to kind of give some examples of things you might find in that book. So just some positive traits that you might consider, negative traits, and maybe for you, maybe being stubborn isn't necessarily a negative trait. So again, it comes down to that personal choice, or sometimes genre too. What traits you want to pick. You want to give your villain positive and negative traits, because we all have positive and negative traits. If your villain is going to be well-rounded, your villain has to have both. They have to have a balance. You don't want to go overboard. Don't give them a ton. It's good to really think about the traits. Don't just go randomly in there, like open a random page, put your finger down and pick it. Think about the traits you're getting and why you're using those ones. Which ones are going to pack the most punch, right? Which are going to be subtle and nuanced, but also totally in the reader's face later. Like they can come back and be like, oh my gosh, yeah, of course, that would lead them down that, right? So I thought it was cute to use these pictures for subtle, but also in your face, right? The red light district, the red light here, subtle, but also very in your face. We know exactly what's going on there, versus our fire truck, which is not so subtle and in your face, but you know exactly what's going on there as well. Okay, sassy and haughty and all things naughty. How do we pick? How do we create, take that whole book and narrow it down? So we want to start with at least one positive and one negative. You want to keep your protagonist, and most of the time you've already got your protagonist, right? You have your protagonist figured out. So you want to keep them in mind when you're choosing your villain's traits. And there's a couple different ways you can go about it. You can pick opposing traits that will ratchet up the conflict, like Peter Pan and Hook, right? They're complete opposites. One's a child, one's an adult, one's a, fun, adventuring, loving kid, and one is this kind of grumpy old pirate that doesn't like anything fun. Also similar traits, right? Similar traits can cause action forks. Like this is where you give them similar traits and then you put them in a same stressful situation and see how they react. And that's really what defines them, right? Like Thor and Loki. Similar traits, right? Similar goals even. But how they react and how they go about achieving those things is what defines them as maybe the hero or the villain. Also, giving your villain positive traits can cause an internal conflict in your protagonist. So think about Hannibal again and Clarice, right? Hannibal's manner, his straightforwardness, his truth telling, those sort of things cause Clarice to sometimes make dumb mistakes, right? Share a little more than she should, that sort of thing. So when you have positive traits in your villain, sometimes it causes even more internal conflict in your protagonist. So you create a good villain. People love to hate villains, right? They love a good villain. So give your villain a reason to be bad. No one is evil for the sake of it. Obviously, there are exceptions, and everyone's going to be like, well, what about this? For the most part, no one is evil for the sake of it. And we'll talk about the exceptions a little bit later. So like even Voldemort, right? He was Tom Riddle once. He was this lonely boy one time. Give them morals. Maybe they're always kind to animals or kids. They should also have emotions. Those emotions are often tied to old wounds. They drive the plot forward. They also create the weakness and the blind spot that your protagonist can use to win, right? Heroes have to make sacrifices to win. Your villains should too. And sometimes if you don't have those books, you don't want to buy those books, think about the quirky people people with like really quirky little ticks or traits or tells or things like that you can use and give to your villain. All right, very important step 3, avoiding cliches, right? Especially with villains. It's so easy to fall into the trap of cliches with your villain. When you neglect taking care of creating a nice, well-rounded villain, you are ultimately going to get a cliche, right? You're gonna need to put something down, and you're gonna fall back on overused things like like cliches. So this is going to get a little confusing, and I'm going to try to make it clear, but it is a little confusing. But let's just talk very quickly, archetypes, tropes, and cliches. So an archetype is the role that the character plays, right? They're the mentor, the sidekick, the villain, the love interest. But there's also character tropes, which is more to the personality. So they could be a wizard, they could be an older brother, they could be a teacher. And the trope, a lot of times what you use as the trope will depend on the genre you're writing. Cliches, however, are overused traits, appearances, themes, phrases that become so predictable and unoriginal that your readers are going to roll their eyes and be like, oh, I hate this person already. Like, they're not going to buy it, right? It's not going to be believable anymore because you use the same thing they've read a million times or they've seen. If you see a villain in a cartoon, avoid those traits. They're a cartoon for a reason. Avoid them like the plague. Although I don't know, is that a thing anymore? Does everybody avoid the plague? I don't know. So a non-exhaustive list of archetypes. So I'm not going to read all of these again. I will happily send you this PowerPoint, but these are just some archetypes of villains, right? Because there's different types. So these are your subtype villains, which you see in a lot of things. So you have your omnipotent villain, your arch nemesis, the revenge villain. Don't forget you have those intangible villains, right? Mr. Hyde, or the ring itself, or that hatred we talked about between the Capulets and Montagues. Tyler Durden. I hope that's not a spoiler. Again, the jealous one, the seductress, the deranged lunatic. I'm gonna put a pin on that because we're gonna come back and talk about it in just a minute. But because those are the people that you're gonna hold up and say, well, what about these ones that are evil for the sake of being evil? Well, we're gonna talk about that in a minute. I know we're going back to definitions again, so just hold with me. Tropes, again, are different than cliches, right? These are recurring themes, concepts, and patterns that are embedded within a genre and personalities of characters. These help to identify the genres, and these are used over and over, right? So think haunted house, right? The haunted house is a trope. It is a horror trope. There are a million stories about haunted houses, but they're not, hopefully not all the same, right? They don't have the same thing. So if you take a ghost and throw a sheet over their head and that's a ghost, and that's more cliche, right? A ghost with a sheet over its head wandering around the house is a cliche. The haunted house is a trope. It gives a sense of familiarity. It kind of helps the reader establish what kind of story they're reading. But you can take a trope and then do something completely different that no one else has ever done. And that's when you hit them with that twist. So you can use them over and over. You just have to make them use them in a new way. Whereas with cliches, you can't really do that. So some general villainous tropes, right? The power hungry, the henchman, the killing the innocents. And then when you get into different genres, your dystopian villains they often have this very hard to argue reason for their system. Think President Snow in the Hunger Games. They often have these big dinners and these balls and these parties to show class difference. And then in your thrillers, you've got these villains with these crazy, inventive ways to escape, and they have their scantily clad women all around them all the time. And in fantasy, they have, they have pet dragons or snakes, and they have the dark wizards and the dark magic. Cliches, however, have your things like, the twirling mustache and the cigar and the scarred faces and the evil laughter, the mwahaha's and the, hot steaming breath and minions that they beat on relentlessly, who just for some reason stick around and continue to be minions. They leave the captured hero to die, right? It's such a cliche. What the heck? Don't they know? Rule 2, double tap, right? You don't leave them to die weak and they'd be like, suffer and die. And then they leave. And then, of course, the hero comes back in the end when you're least expecting it and takes the villain out. They have lairs and dungeons and thrones and self-portraits and things like that. So here's just a few that I could think of off the top of my head for you. So avoiding cliches, right? And we talked about some of those, but what about if I'm writing something historical? Well, if I'm writing something historical, sometimes those cliches need to be used, right? So like, if you try to avoid that cliche, like the cigar smoking bad guy, right? If you're avoiding that cliche in a historical piece about maybe the mob in the 20s when cigars and cigarettes were a very popular culture thing, that was an expectation. Everybody was doing it. So if you start taking that away, then all of a sudden your historical fiction readers are going to call you out on that. So know if you're going to do historical fiction, just know your history, and that's okay. Then it's not really a cliche. You're following what you know to be true at that time. So obviously, no rule is hard and fast. None of these steps are hard and fast, but these are all just tips and tricks to help create a villain. And take as many as you want, and if it doesn't fit for you, throw it out of it. These aren't absolute. Remember when I told you we were going to come back to that whole evil for the sake of evil and that sort of thing? I really want to touch on mental health issues because it's a common thing. It's a unfortunately easy thing to fall back on and give your villain some psychopathy. I'm not telling you don't do it, because there's a whole lot of really brilliant villains out there that have these mental health issues, right? But if you're gonna do it, do your research. Because the last thing you want to do is create a stereotype or a stigmatizing character, right? Because mental health is very complex, right? It's a very complex concept. And when you stereotype or stigmatize these people, you have dumbed down and simplified something very complex. And it's what the simplification is that different equals bad, scary, or weird, right? They're different from the norm, therefore they must be bad, which is a terrible thing, and a terrible thing that we're learning every day, that we don't want to keep that stigmatizing going. So if you're going to do it, do your research, know the illness that you're giving your villain, know it, right? Be authentic. One thing that I see commonly is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is not multiple personality disorder. It's not this, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. They're not the same thing. Also, schizophrenia is not a rare thing. It's a relatively common mental health issue. It's about 1 in 100 incidents, and it is rare for a schizophrenic to exhibit violent behavior, right? So you see schizophrenia used a lot in villains and used improperly. So this is what I'm saying. If you're going to use mental health, if you're going to make a psychopath, just know what their issue is and know those symptoms and know how they would behave. And this book, The Writer's Guide to Psychology, is a great book specifically to do that. So if you want to give a mental illness, even to your protagonist, it's a great book to look at, because it's going to help you to write those things accurately. So you're going to write, it talks about the behaviors, it talks about the treatment, what kind of treatment they would undergo, maybe what might increase their risk of developing these. So it helps you write a background, helps you write a nice character if you're going to write a mental illness into your story. Step 4, that leads us right into psych history. Every one of us has a psych history. It should be something that your primary care doctor is checking up on a yearly basis, if not more. One sec. So we all have it, right? It doesn't mean that we have mental illness. We all have a psych history, though. We're products of our experiences and the things that shape us as humans and adults, and as we grow, and the things that change our personalities are the experiences that had the biggest impact on us. They are the source of our whys, why we do the things we do, what are our motives, things like that are often tied to our experiences. How we react to those experiences make us who we are. So it comes down to choice, right? Batman and Two-Face, right? Batman had a traumatic experience. He went one way, became a vigilante, right? Two-Face was a good guy and then had a traumatic experience, and he chose to go like a revenge route, right? The other way. And so those experiences sort of shape who we are and shape your character into who they are going to become in your story. Oftentimes these experiences, if continued patterns throughout life, they can create what's called a complex, A complex is a pattern of experiences, emotional, physical, spiritual, that form in a person's unconscious mind and influences our future behaviors. It's usually, again, like I said, a repeated experiences. So over and over, it's not usually one thing unless it's one huge thing, right? It's usually repeated experiences throughout life that end up leading a villain down the wrong path. So 2 examples of that might be Scar and Voldemort. Scar has an inferiority complex. Scar was the second born, right? So he's not in line as a throne. His brother was bigger, stronger, more good looking, I suppose, than Scar. So that he has developed over time this inferiority complex, which forces him to do things that make him villain, right? Voldemort, Tom Riddle, lonely, feeling unloved, not feeling the affection, and then ends up fighting against Harry Potter's family, right? And Harry's mother loved him so much that she sacrificed him, and her love saved Harry from Voldemort. So it gives him a reason to truly hate and maybe be jealous of Harry because of this. Dumb it down to mummy complex, but really it's that love that Tom Riddle didn't get, that Harry got, and it saved him, and it created Voldemort's terrible situation in life. So here's where we get to become a fictional god, right? These repeated bad experiences cause what's called a soul scar. Soul scars and the negative traits that you picked so perfectly earlier form that complex, right? So those things work together to form a complex, then you can build on that complex. These are what creates the lies, the belief systems in your villain's head, right? That and people, even good people, can commit terrible acts because they believe it's the right thing to do, or they feel justified. And they feel justified and believe those things because those complexes have created a lie over and over in their head that they've grown to believe. Heroes have them too, but heroes learn from those and they change and they grow. Villains do not. So here's where you get to wield your power, right? So bring your hero in and give him something that the villain wants. Again, that mother who loves them, or the crown, etc. Give your hero something that villain has been missing out on, that has maybe caused that complex. That reaffirms your villain's complex and makes him even angrier, but also makes, when he gets angry and it reaffirms those complexes, oftentimes that leads to the villain making mistakes and bad decisions that will ultimately lead to his defeat. So again, think Scar trusting the hyenas, right? He's making mistakes because he's getting angrier and these complexes are growing, and he's, things are happening that he has no control over, and they're going against his inner belief system. So you can also confirm those things, right? Scar is inferior, he is. Voldemort is hated, he's not loved. And those things will lead to your climax, because when you confirm those beliefs, the villain becomes more dangerous and he no longer has anything to lose. So we talked about soul scars, like these big, huge events or these big, horrible things that have created these complexes, right? And they can be good things and bad things. Maybe you saved somebody's life, right? Maybe you saved somebody from drowning in the ocean one time in your life. Do you think that every time you go on vacation to the ocean that you're going to be able to kick back, relax, and read a book? Or do you think you're going to always kind of be on alert because this has happened once before, right? So you have created complex. You're unable to relax at the ocean anymore because you once had to save a drowning person. And so now it's kind of this, I'm always a little bit on alert when I'm at the ocean because I know what can happen, right? That's a complex. The ocean is not a relaxing place for you where it might be for somebody else. Or other things, you've survived a car crash, or you repeatedly fail exams to the point where you start believing that I'm a terrible test taker. I can't pass an exam. And what bad decisions happen then? Well, there's no sense in me studying. I can't pass an exam. So those sorts of things, right? that just lead them down, and obviously lots of other horrible things, having a terminal illness, being abused, being raped, that sort of thing, clearly will also present complexes. But even little things, again, like, well, not little, saving someone's life isn't little, but even something that you might not think was a horrible, bad experience can also turn out to change you and the way that you view the world. Step 5, your villain needs goals and motivation. So your goal is, what does the villain want, right? Your goal is the what do you really want? Your motivation is your toddler questions. Why? Why do you want these things? Why? So your goal is the outcome that you want, the what of your plan. What does your villain want? Why is the God of story creation, right? That's the motivation. That's what is driving the whole plot, right? The motivation. You got to know your hero's motivation, but you got to know your villain's motivations as well. And this really goes back to that whole beginning thing. You have to create a well-rounded, you have to create a realistic villain. Villains are so much more fun, right? Like I said, they're so much more fun to create because most of the time your hero's motives are the same or predictable, because they're the hero, they're the good guys, so you know what their motives are, right? But villains can have the craziest motives that just happen to get in the way of your hero, right? So those motives, the sky's the limit. You can come up with the craziest stuff, and as long as your villain believes in it, it's going to work. They don't necessarily, if they don't have a clear goal or motive, your story isn't going to move, right? Because if you don't have, your villain doesn't have a clear goal and motive, your hero doesn't have anything to fight against. Like, how is your hero going to fight someone who doesn't even have anything like clear that they're doing? They're just wondering about causing chaos. So no motive, no conflict, no story. So make a good villain. Here's some examples. Hook and Pan, right? Hook's goal, his what, is to kill Peter Pan. Why? Because he hates Pan. You want to deeper do the toddler thing? Why? Why does he hate Pan? Well, because Pan cut off his hand and fed it to a crocodile, and now the crocodile is following him. And also, that's how Captain Hook got his nickname, right? Because now he has a hook for a hand. So there's a lot of, like, that's that soul scar. That's that complex. That's that repeated events that have now caused Hook to be the person that he is and has motivated his hatred for Pan. And then you have the evil queen versus Snow White, right? Her goal is to kill Snow White because why? Because Snow White is more beautiful, and the queen, one of her negative traits is vanity. So we've given her vanity as a negative trait, and now she's so obsessed with her vanity and her beauty that no one else can be more beautiful than her. And if somebody else comes along that's more beautiful, we have to get them out of the way. And the best way to do that would be to kill them, right? So now she has a goal and a motive. Alien. Alien's not human, but it's a living creature. It has a goal, just like every human or every living creature. Its goal is to reproduce and continue to live, right? It continues the species. It happens to need human bodies to do that. So that's its goal. Its motivation, survival. That's super basic, right? But you've created this amazing, horrible character based on just the most basic motivation in the world is survival. So your why leads your motive, leads to action, and then your reactions, right? Reactions are that's what drives your story, is the way that people react, your villain and your hero. Everything we do in life, we have a reason for it. Even serial killers have reasons. The motives justify their actions, and those actions will then cause reactions in your other characters. So your hero's actions will induce a reaction from the villain, and vice versa. And sometimes your heroes and villains might have the same goal, right? So Loki and Thor both want their father's approval, his pride. They want to make him proud. They go about it completely differently, and ultimately their reactions to those goals turn them into different people and turn them, kind of help guide whether they become the hero of the story or the villain of the story. Step 6 is creating a believable villain, right? So not only do they need all these things, but we have to believe that they need these things, right? So there are certain things that you really must have to create just a well-rounded individual in general, not just villains, but any character. They got to have values. There are positive and negative values, right? Everybody has a value. Everyone has values, even your villains. Give your villains positive values that they react to in a negative way, or you can give them negative values too. But like, again, we talked about Hannibal Lecter's manners, right? Miggs was very rude to Clarice in front of Hannibal. And Hannibal reacted because he holds manners very highly. That's one of his values. So he reacted by causing Miggs' death. Voldemort holds loyalty very highly, right? The Dark Mark, that's the proof of loyalty above all. Also, a positive value, dedication to family. But you can have a character that reacts to that particular value, again, in a good way or a bad way, right? So dedication to family. Katniss reacts to her sister getting called up by volunteering to be tribute, to take her place. So Katniss values family, and it makes her a hero. Cersei from Game of Thrones, she also values her family, maybe even a little too much, but she does, and that causes her to do a lot of really horrible, horrible things, right? So she reacts negatively and becomes the villain of the story. They both have the same good value. How they react to it makes them who they are. Again, just a list of examples of positive values you can use and negative values you can use. Integrity, something else. That is part of that whole belief system, right? They have to believe in their values, but believe them to the death. You have to stick to the value. If they do that, that gives them integrity. And that doesn't necessarily mean integrity is good, right? So sticking, with Katniss, and we mentioned President Snow before. Let's use him as a good example to this, right? Snow has values. His values, he values his system of government, the regulation, the way he set things up, his hierarchy, the segregation system, right? He values that organization very much. He also believes that killing must be done with a purpose. You have to have a purpose for killing. And he always tells the truth. He values truth. Those are his values. When Katniss and Peeta break his value regarding his system, right, his very organized system, that only one child should remain at the end of Hunger Games, he's furious. He's absolutely enraged. But he doesn't kill her because he doesn't have a purpose. He can't, there's no purpose to it, right? It's crossing that line of his value system. So he has to come up with other ways to get back to what he wants, like his goal. He has to find other ways around it. So it's created an obstacle for him. And again, he's got this integrity. We've created this believable character because he doesn't just keep, oh, well, that didn't work, I'm going to do this. You've made him a person. Values lead to integrity, lead to credibility, lead to authenticity, right? So credibility and integrity give your characters authentic. Authentic leaders do what they say they will do. And villains can be leaders too, right? Your villain has to do what he says he's going to do. Even if it's hard, even if it's painful. Humanity. Even if your villain isn't human, your readers are, right? So your readers are always going to look for reflections of themselves in your characters. So even if you are giving them dark versions of humanity, you still need to consider some humanistic qualities. So give them those traits. And your villain, here's an example, like your villain could be an expert at something and better at it than the hero, because that gives them an advantage over your hero. It makes them look unbeatable because they suddenly have something that your hero doesn't. And it also creates this underdog for your hero that people love to root for. So just an example. Also, villains need to have some secrets, they need some lies, but they also need some transparency because you are showing a story to a reader, there's got to be some transparency there. If it's all secret, then that's no good either, right? So the reader needs to know. You can give subtle hints. You can give your villain a tell, something that your reader can pick up on. It doesn't have to be that whole, like, you know, the show versus tell. You don't have to tell your reader. And please, yeah, don't tell with a big long monologue by, you know, that cliched thing at the end where the villain is like, this is my plan and this time I'm going to do it while you're here, you know, tied to the train track. Don't do that. Give subtle things. Give them a tell, and make sure they follow through on their threats. Your hero should know that the villain is coming for them, because that's the suspense, that's that intense feeling of, oh my God, when, but they don't know what, they don't know when or how, right? They know why the villain's after them, they know that they're coming after them, but they don't necessarily know when or why. So that's how you're working your transparency and your secret. Step 7, wielding fear successfully. And fear is important, not just in horror, but in a lot of different genres, right? There's got to be a little bit of fear. And we're going to talk a little bit about all the different kinds of fear, right? So I'm not saying fear of the dark, right? And it's just two opposing quotes that I chose. One from H.P. Lovecraft: the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. The oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown, right? I don't know what's happening. I know that suspense. And then Walter John Williams' quote is, I'm not afraid of werewolves or vampires or haunted hotels. I'm afraid of what real human beings do to other real human beings. So maybe more fear of the known, fear of what I know can happen. And both of them are absolutely legitimate fears. And you can choose which one works for your story. For your viewing pleasure, I chose several different phobias and put them in a nice collage for you, a collage of fear, because I am a horror writer and I want to make you uncomfortable. Fear. Here's a little aside for me. One of the reasons I love writing horror is because I feel like fear is the one emotion every single one of us has absolutely 100% experienced in our lifetime, right? Unless you have some mental illness that doesn't allow that part of your brain to work, or you're missing that portion. We've all had fear. And so it's such a ubiquitous and universal emotion that we've all experienced, that to me, sometimes horror feels the most realistic. Because we haven't always, not everyone has experienced maybe romance, and not everybody is imaginative. So for me, I always felt like fear seemed to be the one thing that we all understand. So that's just an aside of why. Maybe that's my why, right? That's my why do you write horror? Why? Because fear is maybe it's the easiest thing to write, right? Because we all know what fear feels like, so it's the easiest thing to explain to somebody. But anyways, so it's an idea. It's a perceived threat. It's oftentimes irrational. It's the monster in the closet, it's the monster under our bed. It's irrational. It's not real, but it still feels real. It's the what if in our minds, and that what if then turns into a lot of different things. And that's also why we all have different fears and phobias, right? Because again, our experiences, our background, this is why we have to build a three-dimensional person, because these fears are oftentimes created by things that we have experienced, seen, observed, been through, etc. And also, where do we live and what culture do we live in, right? Because popular and common fears change as society changes. So think War of the Worlds. Think, like when everyone had bomb shelters. Segregation was a result of a fear, right? The other, rock music, video games, books, censorship is a fear. It all comes from fear. People choose to do things, and I have religion on here, and I know I'm not trying to bash on religion. I'm saying that really I'm talking fanatics, like the ones that become the cult type religion, right? They create a fear to the point that they sort of survive on fear, and they create this fear that everybody's almost like a mass hysteria. drugs, like the war on drugs, right? Drugs are going to ruin it. This is your brain. It's your brain on drugs, right? And here we are now. Science is starting to look at microdosing a lot of different drugs, psychotropic drugs, microdosing all these drugs, and finding that they might treat mental illness better than anything we have on the market, right? So that's changed over time. The fear of what drugs do to the brain has changed over time. So as society changes, as things come and go in our world, our fears come. So also think of that. Like if you're writing a story at a certain time, you might want to think about what was the fear in society at that time? What was the generalized fear? Obviously, it can be tangible. It can be vampires, Bigfoot, spiders, snakes, etc. It can be intangible. You can be afraid that you're going crazy. That fear that you're developing a mental illness. There's a fear that of death. Death is a huge fear. Fear of commitment. If you're writing romance, there you can still put fear in there, right? The fear of commitment is very valid and very oftentimes the obstacle, the villain in a romance story, right? All you have to do is create that idea. The reader's mind is going to do the rest. Like I said, we've all experienced fear. We all know what that feels like. So all you have to do is plant that seed. Let the reader know something's coming, withhold enough info so they don't necessarily know what, where, or when. Some movies that I found have done this beautifully, right? The Witch. The Witch, you watch that movie and every moment is like, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? And then nothing really until the very end, right? But that whole time you've got this fear, something is happening, something bad. There's just this sense of just discomfort the whole way through that movie. Blair Witch, same thing, sort of like they're in the woods, it's dark, they're a little lost, they're seeing these little things that are sort of building a story in their brain, and they're just getting scared more and more and more afraid, right? Sixth Sense, same thing. Like they've planted all these sort of seeds the whole time. You're like, something, what the heck? Something's up here. And until you know the end, then you go back and look at it, you're like, whoa, I had this dread the whole time and I don't know why. These are great examples for how you can wield fear very subtly. So you can use all 5 senses to create fear. Withhold things on purpose. You can misdirect. Just give a hint of evil in your villain. That's all you need. Like I said, it's that seed. That seed. There's something a little off with this character. Something just not quite right. Use your environment and setting, right? Setting can be its own character. You can use those things because if you have dark, overcast weather, the reader already is sort of primed to know something. If it's not so, it's dark and it's stormy, something's going to happen, and they're ready. They're sort of anticipating, but what, they don't know. Make the protagonist obstacles, the things the protagonist comes up against, scary. Even if it's just something scary to your protagonist and not necessarily, you or your reader, because your reader is sort of projected themselves onto this protagonist. So when you use fear, if you give your protagonist a phobia or a fear, that reader's going to feel it with them. And you don't have to be a horror writer. Romance writers use the dreaded fear of commitment all the time to their advantage. Here we are, step 8, show time. So how are we going to do all this, right? How are we going to do this? How are we going to introduce our villain? When are we going to introduce our villain? Some of that has to do with genre. So it depends on what genre you're writing in. So if you're writing a fantasy, oftentimes you're presenting a villain as early as possible, right? Your villain is often your reason, or at least part of the reason that your hero and company are going on their adventure, their journey, right? They're trying to vanquish some foe. In a mystery story, you might not want to say who is the killer until the very end. And if that's what you're doing, if you're waiting to reveal your villain, then you have to at least introduce the concept of a villain. You have to, again, you need that conflict or your story doesn't go anywhere. So you have to introduce the concept of them, very early on in your story. And this is your chance to start misdirecting, and this is your chance to wield fear, like we talked about, right? Giving red herrings, giving them something else to kind of focus on. Is this the fear? Is this what's happening? Cast doubt, be subtle. Readers are super smart. If you're trying to keep it a secret, remember that, right? Your readers, when they read, most readers pick a genre that they enjoy, right? And they're reading that genre. They know those tropes. They know the cliches of that genre. They know those things, right? And they're looking for it because they want to prove that they're just as smart as you, the writer. They want to figure it out way before you want them to, right? That's part of why we enjoy reading. It's a puzzle. They live for that, right? So don't give it to them. Don't repeat details. Like, you put a detail there, let it go. Let them forget about it, right? Let them forget about it until the end and be like, oh shoot, that was way back in the beginning. And don't try to fake your villain by making him appear so good. Don't make him so saintly that you're like, what's going on with this person? Doesn't seem too good to be true, right? Too good to be true. Then suddenly I'm focused on him because he's way too good. There's something up there. So don't make him too good. Again, make him human. Make him, give him humanity. And when you do introduce your villain, give the readers a sense of who they are and what they're about. And that means you have to know who your villain is. That's the whole reason we did this lecture, right? You have to know what your villain is about. And if you know what this person's about, you're going to know how badly can they mess things up, right? How much can they get into the head of your protagonist and mess it up. Your reader needs to know that. Your reader has to be able to extrapolate that. So here's some interview. So if you're creating a villain, I just went through and put a bunch of different questions that you can ask your villain, ask yourself when you're creating a villain, right? Things that you might want to keep in mind. So we talked about the negative, positive traits. What key relationships do they have? What family, friends? Who are their allies, right? It'd be nice for them to have an ally. What would they die for? What are their values? What are their motivations? Who would you kill for? Would you be willing to kill for something? Have you experienced love? What does love feel like to you? What does it mean to be loved? What does it mean for you to love somebody else? What about success? What does success look like? Does your villain have soul scars? And if they do, what are they? And how did they happen? What was the story behind that soul scar? What's their worst memory? What's their happiest? Do they have fears? Do they have phobias? What are their greatest achievements? What are they the most proud of? Have you ever sacrificed? Have you ever compromised? What about things that you are absolutely ashamed of, these secrets that you keep hidden that no one knows? What's the worst thing you've ever done? What about with your parents? What are your relationships like with your parents? What is childhood like? Who would you call in the middle of the night if you were in a lot of trouble? How do you generally interact with people? What are your goals, motivations, and priorities within this plot? Please, you got to know this. You got to know this before anything else, right? If you've got a villain, your villain better have a goal and motivation too. And what would he do to get that, or she? And what wouldn't they do? Where is the line? Is there a line? And if so, where is it? And that's the line your protagonist is going to have to take them to. What would make them cry, smile, laugh, totally lose control, flip out? What is their greatest event? Regret, achievement, failure, happiest memory, particular talent. So all of these things are things you can kind of think of as you're creating your villain. References. I don't know where we are. Oh, good. So references, these are the two books that I used to create this, this lecture. Obviously, I did not use all 13 steps to evil. I conglomerated it down to 8. But that one, Sacha Black's book, she has a number of books, also creating a hero. I think she has creating a horror villain. I know she has several in this series, and they're small books. Both of these books are super thin. They're small. They're quick, easy. Like, they're one-day reads. You can easily get through them in a day, and they have lots of discussion questions, lots of thought-provoking things for you to, like a little workbook you can fill out as well. And I think they're both really great, straight to the point, easy reads, quick and easy to go back to. And then those reference books I told you about as well are also super great books to use. So I am going to actually open chat right now. I think he is. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, 3 minutes. So I don't see any questions. And I gave you my email. So if there's anything you do want to know, let me know. If you want me to send you this PowerPoint, I'd be happy to do that as well. Just shoot me an email if this isn't already logged in. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming and listening. And I hope I didn't zip through it too fast. I just want to make sure we hit all the high points. And I hope you got something from it. And go create a really awesome villain because I love them. All right. Thanks.